Welcome, everyone, to our series on the most important battles of the Civil War. We are on Battle 9.
Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast.
This is a
the
battle
unscripted
that
show
is
that celebrates unsung heroes,
in this episode,
myth-busts historical lies,
the next one following
and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world.
You remember in our previous
host,
episode,
Scott
we were looking
Rank.
at the Union victory following the Battle of Chattanooga. Chattanooga was sort of the gateway to the South, and its capture opens up that gateway. But Atlanta is a crucial city. Today, if you hear of Atlanta, you think of Coca-Cola, or Center for Disease Control, or Ted Turner, Jeff Foxworthy, or Ludacris and Little John if you're into hip-hop. But in the period of the Civil War, Atlanta is much smaller than it is now, of course, but it was also an important rail and commercial center. So it's small in population, but it was a critical point of contention during the Atlanta campaign of 1864. Crucial, critical things are going to be happening here in these battles that pave the way for the conclusion of the war. We've talked about politics a little bit and how they fit into military plans, and a good outcome from Abraham Lincoln basically ensures Union victory. But is it assured, or is it just one of those narratives of history that are convenient for high school teachers that really don't know much about history but want to get through that period? We're going to find all that out and more in this episode and the next one to follow. So, James, set us up here. What happens after Chattanooga?
All right, after Chattanooga, which of course was an amazing, almost in some ways miraculous Union victory, which broke all the rules about what's supposed to happen in battles. After the Union victory, that was November 1863 at Chattanooga, there was very little action anywhere, east or west. We've talked about this many times before, but again, it bears repeating that in general, Civil War armies don't do a lot during the winter. It's cold, and it rains a lot in most parts of the country, and the mud, see, I'm already thinking ahead. The rains turn into mud. They become muds, basically. And I think I just said the wrong thing again. Let me try that one more time. The roads, because of the rain, turn into mud. Yeah, it's like a tongue twister. The rain in Spain follows mainline the plain. But so there's not going to be a whole lot going on for a little while. We saw that the commander of the Confederate Army at Chickamauga, which of course had been a Confederate victory, and then Chattanooga, which of course was a big Confederate loss. The commander had been Braxton Bragg. He is finally relieved of command and replaced by Jefferson Davis. Not Jefferson Davis is the commander, but he's making the decisions, of course. He's commander-in-chief. And he puts his old nemesis, Joseph Johnston, in command. He didn't want to do that, but there just really wasn't anybody else available who had the experience and the ability to command a big army. And Ulysses S. Grant, who had been for a few months, commander of all the Union forces in the West, he came up with a strategy called exhaustion. And exhaustion simply means destroying the enemy's ability to make war, destroying the transportation network, destroying the industrial capacity, and the ability to produce food, among other things. It's not the same as a strategy of attrition. Attrition is when you wear down the other guy's army. You lose 10,000 men, he loses 10,000, but it hurts more. That's what's going to happen in the East later on. We'll talk about that in a future episode. But in the West, it's going to be as much about destroying the enemy's resources as it is going to be about destroying the enemy's army. Of course, Grant wants to do both of those, but there's going to be an increased emphasis on not just attacking armies, but also attacking farms and killing cattle and destroying crops or eating them up or burning them. Basically depriving the Confederates of their breadbasket, if you will.
Yeah, I was curious about that because I've heard of the war of attrition strategy, whether it's done offensively or defensively. And one example that came to my mind was the Second Punic War between Rome and Carthage, where Hannibal invades the Italian peninsula, and the Roman general Scipio Africanus is constantly retreating in order to stretch Hannibal's supply lines to the breaking point, which they do, and finally he has to leave the Italian peninsula. So they run out of resources. But are you saying that exhaustion, it goes further than that? It's not just the resources of the military, but it's on a bigger social level?
It is. They're going to take the war to the people. And it's not that Grant and Sherman were these cruel, horrible people that just wanted all the civilians in the Confederacy to die, although they are often accused of that, especially Sherman. But they actually wanted to bring the war to an end as quickly as possible. And there's no better way to end a war than for the opponent to be starving to death. You hate to do that to them. You don't want them to starve. But at the same time, if they begin to starve, they'll stop the war. They'll, if not have a revolution, they'll put a lot of pressure on the government to end the war. Or a lot of the soldiers will just throw down their arms and go home, which begins to increasingly happen in the Confederacy.
Right. That's not too different from the logic of Curtis LeMay, the Army Air Corps general who engineered the firebombing of Tokyo in World War II, thinking, I know this is horrific, but lives will actually be saved if we do this now. And you can argue about the merits of whether that's true or not, but that was his same logic also.
Yeah, it's something that's done in every war to some degree, I think. But it had kind of gone out of fashion by this point. Prior to the Civil War, a lot of wars were believed to be a professional affair where you just send the two armies out and they fight, but the average Joe back in the farm or in the city doesn't get involved with it. It wasn't total war, but the Civil War is gradually turning into more of a total war where it affects everybody, whether you're a soldier on the front, let's say in Tennessee, or you're a plantation owner or even a small farmer down in the middle of Georgia, far from the fighting. You're going to be affected. All right, let's move on. Grant decided not to try and occupy large areas of the Confederacy. He realized, it would be nice if they could, but they just didn't have enough men to occupy every single part of the Confederacy, so they're going to focus on key places. And Sherman, meanwhile, is going to kind of do a trial run of this exhaustion strategy. He marched his army to Meridian, Mississippi, living off the land and destroying much of what was in their path. And this proved that exhaustion worked. And again, I will repeat what I mean by living off the land. And for those who have heard me explain this before several times, I apologize, but just in case we have somebody listening who maybe hasn't heard the other episodes prior to this, living off the land just means the army feeds itself on whatever it finds in the path of its march. That is opposed to having a supply line, which means you bring your army with you. It's kind of like, I'll give you an analogy. Let's say you go to work, you can either bring your lunch, or when it gets to be lunchtime, you can just go scrounge around and see what you can find. If your office is like mine, sometimes you can walk around and see candy on every secretary's desk and other people's desks too. And you could, I don't know if you would want to have candy as your entire lunch, but you could probably feed yourself without having brought anything. I don't know if the other employees would appreciate that, especially if you take somebody's lunch.
Raid the fridge in the teacher's lounge. You can do what you have to do.
Yeah, raid the teacher's lounge. That's exactly what Sherman's army is going to do, is they're going to essentially steal their lunch and their breakfast and their dinner from the people in whose territory they are marching.
Right, and this isn't like the Mongols that are ravishing land. He has special field orders that describe how it's done, and of course there are soldiers that go too far, and we'll look at in the next episode what these field orders look like. And one last thing, just before, James, you really jump into this narrative, the strategy of Sherman pushing far and trying to get far into the South, take Atlanta, Grant deciding that we're not going to occupy every square inch of the Confederacy. All right, everyone, fill up your shot glasses because I'm going to mention Napoleon. This is a classic Napoleonic strategy.
Vive la France!
There's an idea. Some might have this idea that you have to do something like an oil spill, where you're a blob that spreads out and you occupy every bit of territory. What Napoleon frequently did, thanks to his tactics that enabled lightning-fast warfare, was to push far into enemy territory, go way past other garrisons, other towns, take a city. And what would often happen is that if a city fell, it was a node of an entire network, and that network would fall as well. The outlying armies, the small garrisons that were ahead of the city couldn't operate with this city fallen. Small towns wouldn't be able to operate independently. And suddenly, the fall of this one city would collapse this whole network, that would have a multiplier effect and make the victory much bigger than if they just had to go piecemeal by piecemeal, small town by small town. This is what Sherman does, and this is what Grant envisions and masterminds. And we've faulted soldiers for using offensive tactics from the Napoleonic era, from doing charges and causing an enormous amount of loss of life. But here, this is a Napoleonic tactic that works well. So there you are. So that's one piece of Grant's plan, but James, what's Grant's master plan?
All right, Grant, because of as a reward for his successes, and he'd had so many successes by this point, but especially for the victory in Chattanooga, Lincoln rewards him on March 2nd, 1864. He promotes Grant to lieutenant general. That's a 3-star general. And he names him general-in-chief of all U.S. armies. So he replaces General Henry Halleck, who is demoted to chief of staff. He basically becomes a paper pusher. Grant is now the top general of all the U.S. Army, the Union Army. And I just want to mention in passing, I find this kind of interesting. Only one other person in U.S. history at this point had even risen to the rank of lieutenant general or 3-star general. Can you guess who it is, Scott? You may know.
I can't. My pre-Civil War history is not that good. So,
all right, let's see. Listeners, what do you think? All right, listeners, help him out. Okay, I think I heard somebody say George Washington. Ding, 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 George Washington. It's hard. This always kind of makes me chuckle, or I don't know. It never ceases to amaze me because nowadays our army is so huge, and you've got a lot of 4-star generals. You've got a lot of 3-star generals. We'd never had a 4-star general at this point. Washington was the only person who had risen to the rank of 3-star or lieutenant general. And I guess as a way of honoring Washington so that nobody would ever equal Washington, the U.S. Army had never promoted anybody higher than 2-star general, which is major general. All of the Union generals, McClellan, General Meade, General Burnside, General Hooker, the highest they could get was major general or 2-star. So, but how do you know who outranks whom? It goes by date of rank. So if, let's say, well, for example, General Burnside, his date of rank, the day that he was given the promotion to major general, was earlier than Meade's. So he was higher in the pecking order than General Meade. But that's just kind of trivia there. I think that's kind of interesting. Oh, I should say that Winfield Scott had been given a brevet, depending on how you pronounce it, promotion to lieutenant general. That's just an honorary promotion. They didn't have medals back in these days. People didn't earn medals like a Purple Heart or a Silver Star or something. So instead, officers would be breveted, meaning an honorary commission to a certain rank. Anyway, all that, I guess that's neither here nor there, but it's a great honor for Grant. He now is the highest ranking general in the U.S. Army, and he's in charge, and he's in charge of planning too. Now, Grant could have made his headquarters in Washington, D.C. He could have just set up an office and sent out telegrams, but I think everybody realizes by now that's not the kind of man Grant was. That's not the kind of commander he was. He decided to make his headquarters in the field with the Army of the Potomac. And we'll talk more about this later. But General Meade, George Gordon Meade, who was the commander of the Army of the Potomac, beginning with the Battle of Gettysburg, he stays in technical command of the Army. He's never relieved. But Grant is the one really calling the shots. Grant tells Meade what to do, and then Meade does it. Now, in the East, Grant is not going to carry out a strategy of exhaustion. Lee's army itself would be his target. But in the West, it's going to be a little different. Grant comes up with a master plan, a 5-part strategy to bring the war to an end. And this is going to rely on 5 different generals. First of all, he wants General Nathaniel Banks. We last talked about him with the siege of Port Hudson, which was actually the last fortress to fall in the Mississippi. It's not as famous as the Vicksburg siege and capture, but it's important nonetheless. So General Banks is going to march on Mobile, Alabama, which is the last major Confederate port that's still in Confederate hands, on the Gulf Coast anyway. He's going to take it, and then he's going to move eastward toward Georgia. There were no significant Confederate armies in the area, so it should have been really easy for Banks to do this. So that's part 1. Part two is that Sherman, now in command of all Western armies, he moves up to Grant's old position. He's going to march toward and take Atlanta, and he's going to have to deal with General Joseph Johnston and the Confederate army there. Then that's part two.